this is a Trump thing. And his advisors want this as their thing because, I'm going to repeat this, their vision of rule is autocratic. And we'll talk a little bit about immigration. We can apply that to immigration. We can apply that to what they're doing to U.S. agencies. We can apply it to what they're doing on the environment. But when you're an autocratic administration, you don't want the courts interfering with you, which is why you try to trash them by saying there's a judicial coup if they rule against you. And you hope the Supreme Court gives you cover, which the Supreme Court is doing. And if Congress ever threatens not to stand with you, you threaten the individual members, even if they're of your own party. And that now is the new normal, or the new abnormal in American politics because of Trump.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, welcome back.
Fine afternoon to you, Louis.
Well, Trump's big, beautiful bill has passed through the Senate. What does that mean for Trump and this bill, which might now have a new name?
Yeah, well, we've been debating for weeks whether it's beautiful. It certainly is big. I mean, more than 900 pages, but it means that we're part way through the story, but we still might have a surprise ending. Where we are as I speak to you on Wednesday is that yesterday, the Senate, the upper chamber of Congress, passed the bill, but it required the tie-breaking vote of J.D. Vance, the vice president, because 3 Republicans joined all 47 Democrats and the independent Senator Bernie Sanders in opposing this. Had it not been for Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who has publicly said that the bill is terrible, but decided to vote yes, whether or not it's because there were some concessions made to her state of Alaska in the last few moments before the vote. Had it not been for her flip, this bill would have collapsed. Now, even though it went through, the challenge for the Trumpist is that the House version of the bill, which passed by a single vote several weeks ago, and the Senate version of the bill are different. They're different on key provisions, including the level of spending cuts, including the way that they approach healthcare in particular. And so they have to be reconciled. And if you reconcile them, you have to put them up for another vote, the final reconciled version in both the House and in the Senate. Now, why is that not a done deal, despite Donald Trump saying he'll get it through by the 4th of July? There's a challenge to the bill from within the Republican Party, from 2 different groups. There is a group of Republicans who think the bill doesn't go far enough in its spending cuts, despite the fact it cuts more than $1 trillion from healthcare, which is unprecedented. I think if you asked any American up to Trump 2.0 whether Medicare or Medicaid would be touched, they would say no, they're sacred. But no, he's cutting by more than $1 trillion. He's cutting provision of food aid with the risk that 8 million people will lose that. Despite all of those serious cuts, there are a group of Republicans who want to go even farther, call them the fire breathers, and they are supported by Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk opposes this bill in part because it removes support for renewable energy and for green energy, including that means electric vehicles and Tesla. But he also makes the point that the fire breathers make, which is that you're increasing the government deficit, despite the cuts, by at least $3.3 trillion. That's on top of the $36 trillion deficit the U.S. is already running. So the fire breathers are saying, look, we don't want an increase in the debt ceiling to allow this. We don't want an increase in effectively the ability to max out the credit cards. And we want you to go further to get much closer to balancing the budget. You also have the opposition, however, from another wing, which are the moderates who say, no, you're cutting healthcare too much. This is damaging, in fact, we're talking tens of millions of Americans that are going to be affected by this. And they're making the point that the top 20% of Americans will benefit from this bill. They'll have an average increase in their incomes of about 3%. And of course, the richer you are, the better it'll get. The lowest 20% of Americans, the poorest 20% of Americans, will suffer a cut of 3% in their incomes. They'll be even poorer. Just to add one note as to how you've gotten yourself into this conundrum. How could the Trumpists cut healthcare, cut food aid, cut subsidies to energy companies, and still run up the debt by such a large amount? Because this is a massive tax giveaway. The key point here is that this is a budget which isn't done in terms of a economic policy, in terms of social policy, in terms of trying to join up trade and manufacturing investment. This is a tax giveaway to make Trump's tax cuts in 2017, which were due to expire this year, permanent. And that's Trump's focus. Trump's focus is the tax giveaway. And of course, a lot of wealthy Americans and therefore Republicans will support that. But you still got those two factions that you have to try to pull into line before this can get final passage.
And, this whole bill has really torn up Trump's team and the Republican Party. There is often a lot of controversy about issues like raising the debt ceiling. But, is this just a controversial bill, or does it say something a bit more about the nature and ego within the Trump team?
Oh, you've nailed it. It says not just about what the ego is within the Trump team. It says that this ain't your government of Ronald Reagan. This ain't your government of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or George W. Bush. This is not the way government used to proceed. I need to back up just a step to explain that. Let me ask a question, Louis. We're talking about the big, beautiful bill. How many pieces of legislation has the Trump administration introduced in Congress, significant pieces of legislation, as we approach the 6-month mark? Do you know how many there are?
It's not many.
It's all one. The big, not so beautiful bill is the only piece of legislation that they have introduced. How has Trump been ruling? He's been ruling by decree, or to put it nicely, executive order. In other words, it used to be that you would have a relatively few number of executive orders and that you would do what you want to do as a presidency by introducing a budget, introducing other measures. You would therefore go through what's called, the advise and consent approach of Congress, whether that be with treaties, whether that be with legislation. Now, Trump doesn't operate that way. Trump operates by saying my way or the highway, and then you get Congress to accept that by accepting his executive orders, and then when he finally does come up with a single bill, to fall in line with that. And if you don't fall in line with that, if you're a Republican, he will try to get you out of Congress. So in one of the telling stories this week, Tom Tillis, who is one of the 3 senators to vote against the bill this week, he's voted against it and with a passionate speech about how much damage it does to many Americans. Trump came out and said, we're taking you out of Congress, mate. We're going to primary you, right? In other words, we're going to run someone against you next year when you go up for re-election. And whether or not that's what made the decision for Tillis, he is not going to run next year. Now, there's a wider story here. It means Trump could actually get one of his own into Congress and shore up his base, or it could mean he hands the seat to the Democrats. But I'll park that for the moment. The point here is that Tom Tillis is gone. Representative Don Bacon from Nebraska, who has criticized the Trump folks on a number of policy issues, even though he's a staunch conservative, he's not going to stand for re-election. You're at the point now where Trump is not deciding on this as a Republican policy. This is a Trump thing. And his advisors want this as their thing because, I'm going to repeat this, their vision of rule is autocratic. And we'll talk a little bit about immigration. We can apply that to immigration. We can apply that to what they're doing to U.S. agencies. We can apply it to what they're doing on the environment. But when you're an autocratic administration, you don't want the courts interfering with you, which is why you try to trash them by saying there's a judicial coup if they rule against you. And you hope the Supreme Court gives you cover, which the Supreme Court is doing. And if Congress ever threatens not to stand with you, you threaten the individual members, even if they're of your own party. And that now is the new normal or the new abnormal in American politics because of Trump.
And I do want to move on to immigration, but just before that, we should mention Elon Musk. He's come back again to criticize the bill, as you mentioned before there. It's increasingly looking like he is now just going to be a permanent thorn in Trump's side, isn't he? How much damage could that do?
Yeah, how big a thorn? And that you've already nailed the huge question, but let's walk this through in terms of how we got here, because remember, 6 months ago, man, this is the bromance. It's the guys that are gonna take the chainsaw to the entire US government and they'll be standing over the ruins triumphant, right? And let's be very plain here. What happened is that not just Trump, but the key Trump advisors, the whole Project 2025 approach to seize power, they used Musk to do that. That's what Doggy or Doge or whatever they pronounce that damn so-called department is, right? Is that they went in to just butcher the department, steal their records, threaten the employees, force them to resign or fire them. But this fell apart. And the key point here is, why does it fall apart? It falls apart. I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk. I know there's a shocker here, but it does fall apart on a couple of points of principle here. Elon Musk stands with what I would call the fire breathers that we talked about, which is he does not believe that you should increase the federal government's deficit. Now, to do that, he's willing to slash and burn almost every government program except support for renewable energy, which he kind of likes, and support for SpaceX, which he likes even more. But the point here is that he will put up on his Twitter timeline, still call it Twitter, just to be different. His Twitter timeline, he's going to put up a photograph of Milton Friedman, who is the 1980s Reagan-era economist who said, you don't run a federal deficit. That's effectively the equivalent of a tax on the American people. You don't run that. Well, that's precisely what the Trump folks are doing. And so Musk, for months, even before the break with Trump, he was criticizing the big, not so beautiful bill on this. And then, of course, there is a broader point of principle that Musk is putting out beyond his own companies, which is he foresees the fact that China is overtaking the United States in terms of its use of renewable energies, its use of effectively battery power, working off of different energy sources, where he says China is going to leave the U.S. behind. Now, you can agree or disagree with Musk, but that is a point of difference that isn't just ego. But of course, the ego is involved with it as well. What can he do? He had run the flutter. He ran one of those damn polls he runs, which not exactly scientific. How many people agree with me that there should be a new political party? He did that a couple months ago, and like 80% said, yay, brilliant. So he gets back to it yesterday. He says Republicans and Democrats are the same party. They're the Porky Pig Party. Well, they're not the same party, but again, that's his point, which is everybody's just increasing deficit spending. So maybe I should start a new party, right? Well, there is a lesson here, which is that third parties, because of the nature of the American system, find it very, very difficult to break through. And if you think about the third parties that exist, the breakthroughs they've made don't actually come from being separate parties. So the Libertarian Party, complete, basically, social freedom, economic freedom, military freedom, let it all cut loose, right? Well, okay. As we're smoking marijuana and not paying taxes, like good libertarians, their one representative in Congress is Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky. And he did it within the Republican Party. And if you think about the Green Party in America, the greatest success for the green causes, and I'm a big supporter of them, but it has come from within the Democratic Party, right? If you think about the elements of what the Green New Deal, which is actually, despite the fact that it became trashed by attack media, it's actually a pretty good idea. Okay, well, that's within the party. Donald Trump's example is probably the best example of how you do this within the two-party system, which is you take over a party. Trump did it not only by becoming president, he then and his group around him support Trumpist challengers to Republican incumbents in primaries. They primary them. It's now a verb in the English language. And they get their own people in. And that would be the play that Musk would, if Musk was serious about this. Who's going to be people who will line up with what he thinks, who are going to challenge the Trumpists? And can he mobilize not just his own personal wealth, but others who have personal wealth to do so? In other words, there's a fascinating side story here, which is that one of the stories of Trump's rise and of the Trumpist rises is because one of the richest men in the world, Peter Thiel, who also comes out of AI, comes out of the tech pros, he's been behind them for years. So now you got Peter Thiel, who's responsible for the rise of the Trumpists. Now you got the fact, can Musk do it with his own folks that he supports? It'll at least generate headlines. The more immediate thing that we watch for is there were some Republican senators who Musk used to push really hard and promote, who I thought might flip against the bill. Mike Lee of Utah was one. In the end, they voted for the bill. So what happens as we go through the next round of votes? Do they continue to stand alongside Trump, or does Musk somehow swing one or two senators that could be the decisive votes to completely scupper the Trumpist project?
Well, while all of this was going on in the Senate yesterday, Trump was visiting his new alligator Alcatraz holding facility for undocumented migrants. What message is he trying to send there? Was that just a stunt, or is that a wider part of Trump's moves on immigration?
It's a PR stunt. It also is part of the wider moves of immigration, but I'm going to respond to this, Louis, a little bit just personally. It also just shows how nasty Trump and the Trumpist can be. And I just mean nasty. Just think about this. I grew up with the mantra, and I may not get it exactly right, so don't come after me in the YouTube comments, but, give me you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, you're downtrodden. The inscription that's on the Statue of Liberty from the poem by Emma Lazarus. I grew up with that, right? Here we are in 25. Can you run faster than an alligator? That's where we are now, right? And I go back and look at that Trump clip. You actually see him enjoying himself, going before the media and talking about, oh, look at him now. Now they got a zigzag here through Alligator Alley to run fast, and it's like reveling. And in the soundbite he's going to get, where if you actually think about it and work about this, what are they talking about here? They're talking about taking 5,000 people, many of them without a hearing. They're going to threaten them with deportation, but in the interim, they're going to threaten them with, if they're not deported, indefinite detention in an area of Florida, which is very, very hot, very humid. I got family that live not in that area. They live on the Gulf Coast where it's a little bit cooler, but I know that area well, right? So it's not just alligators. It's just not a pleasant place to live. They're going to put them in conditions. They're going to put them in tents, for example, that may not actually be the most humane conditions that they talk about. And they are doing it with no regard to due process, with no regard to the minimum standards that they feel they have to observe. They're just going to throw people down there, and they're doing it for political gain. Start with Ron DeSantis before you get to Trump, because Ron DeSantis is the one who was doing all the PR ops before Trump did it, because he's governor of Florida. And why is Ron doing it? Well, Ron ran for president in 2024, and he cocked it up. Now, Ron would like to run for president again in 2028, but there are a lot of Republicans in Florida who don't like him. So he's trying to rebuild his rep there by being tougher than Trump, right? That Trump goes down there. And why is he trying to do that? Because he's losing ground on immigration. We're going to talk about some other issues with respect to this, but I want to get this across. And I'm going to preface this by saying, on one of your rival outlets that's not nearly as good as you are, a TV outlet, this morning, and you know which one it is, but we'll let them guess. There's a spokesman for Republicans abroad who pops up all the time. And he comes on there and he says, everybody loves what Trump's doing, right? Everybody loves this. 66% of Hispanics support mass deportations. Wrong. In January, at the start of Trump's administration, 31% of Hispanics supported mass deportations, not 66. And that number has dropped. By March, perhaps the more important poll is 42% of Hispanics feared that they or someone they knew could get swept up and detained. 42%, right? overall, support for Trump is dropping sharply amongst Hispanics. Surprise, surprise. But here's the kicker, that to get back to where our point is that support for Trump on immigration as a general issue has fallen. He had about a plus 4% surplus about a month ago. But because he went in so hard against migrants and asylum seekers, starting with what they tried to do in LA, bringing the military in, he's now down about 3.5%. In fact, almost 4%. They're about, it's around about 49 to 45 in terms of 49% disapproval, 45% approval. Now, I can't guarantee it's going to stay that way. But if you're Trump people, you're looking at this and realizing we're not gaining support, even though we're claiming that we've stopped immigrants coming across the Mexico border. What are we going to do? We're going to double down even harder. And also, because certain people are ideologically committed to this. And the one name that is not getting mentioned here that should do is Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller, who's been with Trump from the start as a speechwriter, then as a trusted advisor. I'm going to say he's one of the nastiest people I've ever witnessed. I don't just mean in politics. I don't just mean the media. He's just nasty. He's xenophobic. He has a hatred, and I do mean that, for many groups. He is a person who has campaigned not only for getting undocumented migrants out of the country, getting asylum seekers out of the country, getting refugees out of the country. He said he wants to get most legal immigrants out of the country. And Miller does this not by discussing the issue, not by giving the whole, in terms of a dialogue on what the facts are, economic, social, civic. He does this with attack politics through and through. So alligator Alcatraz, it's symbolic, but it's representative of the policy, and it's also representative of the lengths to which the Trump administration will drag the country down with this our vicious way, or give me your tired, your poor, old way. Which do you choose?
And we're talking about what may or may not be a stunt and Trump's immigration policy. We were speaking just before this interview started about Zoran Mamdani, the candidate for New York mayor. There's been a sort of threat or implication by the Trump team that they could look at his immigration status or possibly even try to deport him. What's going on there?
Louis, I'm getting to the point now where we're almost like every issue we come up, we connect the stunt to something which is beyond the stunt, which affects far more people, and which is the serious edge of what is happening here. I think it's a good way to proceed as we cut through all the white noise of the Trump folks. And the white noise starts off with is that Zoran Mamdani, who is the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City, he won that nomination last week, a couple of weeks ago, against the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and the current mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. Mamdani was born in Uganda. He is of Indian descent, and he's Muslim, Indian Muslim, right? So he is this example of diversity in America, a diversity that once used to be celebrated. He's run on policies in New York, which is affordable housing, affordable food, green energy in a responsible way, fair taxation, a lot of things that I think, possibly should be done. He's also a democratic socialist, and he doesn't backtrack from being called that, despite socialism being a bad thing. You can see where I'm going with all of this. He's all of the red flags for the Trumpist, like rolled into one package. And they're going to try to exploit this by using the fear factor across America. And they start off with an advantage that not only they are working at the fear factor, there's some Democrats in the center. In Ireland, where I am, there's a prominent commentator who does this. In the UK and in the US, who also are like, oh my God, Mamdani's going to drag us all down because he's just too far to the left. And so they're doom mongering already. So how do you whip up that doom mongering and then play to your nasty, vicious rhetoric? You say you're going to strip Mamdani of citizenship. Well, how can you do that? Well, he's a naturalized citizen. I think it was in 2015 when he was in his early 20s. And he is a supporter of basically people being allowed to survive in Gaza, as blatantly as that. He opposes killing people in Gaza. He also supports the state of Palestine as well. So now you've got the idea that supporting the state of Palestine and killing people in Gaza is support for terrorism. So we're going to strip him of naturalization. And you can see all the issues that they're going to put up to grab the sound bites and where it's going to play in attack media. Here's the sharp edge, though. What is not going to be noted as much in those attack stories is that a few days ago, the Trump folks told the Justice Department, which they've taken over, instead of investigating civil rights, instead of investigating discrimination, instead of doing your job, we want you to aggressively pursue denaturalization, which is the fancy word for stripping people of citizenship if you can find something on them. Now, in some cases, it might be there's a serious criminal charge. So if someone has become a citizen, but they're put into prison, can we strip them of naturalization, then deport them? That's the play, right? In other cases, however, Justice Department lawyers are giving a wide latitude. You got a parking ticket, you didn't pay back your student loan, you said something which could be construed as a threat on social media, we're going to bring a case against you. Now, we don't know how many cases they'll bring, but just as we saw with legal migrants, students, people who are working in the United States, where they could be swept up and detained just because of a social media post or because they supported Palestine or because they had a parking ticket. Now you can do the same thing against US citizens. That's the line they've crossed, Louis, is that they're now going after US citizens. And they've done this within 6 months of taking office. So that's the serious import of the Mamdani case, even though the white noise is going to try to focus on the individual rather than the broader issue.
And we haven't got a huge amount of time left now, Scott. So I do want to briefly touch as well on Ukraine and the US's support there. You've discussed this already today with our other program, Frontline, which people can see on our YouTube channel and elsewhere across Times Radio's broadcasting. But as is the case with a lot of Trump news at the US news at the moment, the situation has changed even in the few hours between those programs. What is the situation with Trump's support for Ukraine, and is there any hope left for the US-backed ceasefire talks?
Look, there's always hope left for Ukraine because Ukraine stands after 40 months against Russia, and because it's more than Trump, because it's the Europeans, it's the international community, and it's the Ukrainians themselves. That's the takeaway from talking to Philip Ingram. But what's happening within the Trump administration? And here, I think it's a really important question of getting beyond the sound bites on Trump. Yes, he did speak to Vladimir Putin recently. Yes, Putin plays him or tries to play him like a fiddle. We know that. Yes, Trump is unpredictable and he's chaotic. What happened here where the Trump administration has suspended the delivery of weapons and other aid that had been authorized by the Biden administration? What happened here? And here you have to go beyond Trump to go into the workings of the administration and how this works. Immediate context for the story. You know, the Biden administration authorized $66 billion of military aid to Ukraine during the Russian invasion. Some of that money, and therefore some of the weapons, were still in the pipeline, even though the Trump administration has not authorized a dime in new military aid. Last month, the Trump administration, or I should say in May, the Trump administration finally began shipping some of that Biden administration aid because there were adults in the room in the Trump administration who said, no, we're not going to just simply do the Kremlin's bidding. No, we're not going to simply say nasty things about Vladimir Zelensky. So there were some F-16 parts, there was some 50 caliber ammunition that was going to. Now, there was some more ammunition that was due to go out. There was some more equipment that was supposed to go out. There were some more rockets and missiles that were supposed to go. And importantly, there were more Patriot missiles. These are the air defense missiles. When the Russians fire their drones and missiles every single night, hundreds of them, on Ukraine civilians. Have you ever heard the name Eldridge Colby, Louis? There's not an Eldridge Colby report. There's not going to be an Eldridge Colby headline in the Times with respect, and y'all are a great newspaper. But Eldridge Colby is the director of planning, policy planning in the Pentagon. He doesn't like aid to Ukraine. He thinks America should be gearing up for confrontation with China. China's the big threat. On top of that, there has been a little bit of a set to in the Middle East recently that you may have read about, where Israel had a 12-day war on Iran. The combination of Eldridge Colby and that change circumstance meant that the Pentagon had been reviewing since March whether it wanted to send missiles, including air defense missiles, to Ukraine or to elsewhere. A couple of weeks ago, because of the imminent Israel war on Iran, they started diverting air defense missiles to the Middle East to protect Israel and to protect Americans in the Middle East. But on a wider basis, Eldridge Colby finally completed his policy review, and surprise, surprise, I said, oh my gosh, we're short of weapons. We just can't give them to Ukraine. You're not short of missiles. You just have a set of priorities, at least for Eldridge Colby and some folks, which happen to be not for Ukraine's resistance against Russia. So I'm afraid it's a much more mundane story than Vladimir Putin playing Donald Trump or J.D. Vance getting mad at Vladimir Zelensky. But it just shows this deep divide in the Trump administration, that if you're working in NATO, if you are committed to European security, you know how serious this is. But if you've decided that European security is not your priority, which is the position of the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, if you decided, in fact, the Europeans should do this on their own, which is the position of Mr. Eldridge Colby, well, upshot of all this, Louis, we cannot assume that the Trump administration is an ally of Ukraine, of Europe, or the UK, which I think is still part of Europe, but I know some people treat it separately. So I'll end on that note.
And just briefly, you did touch there on the Israel, Gaza and Israel-Iran conflict. Trump's seemingly trying to get a lid back on that conflict now. He seems to have sort of declared some sort of ceasefire. What's going on there?
Here we go. Here's your headline. Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. All right. So Trump, there is a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. And there's a story I can tell you about how everybody played Trump to get us to that position. They played his ego. That fragile ceasefire is holding. But now Trump is like, oh my gosh, what do we do now? I'm going to get a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. I am going to speak to the Israeli envoy, Ron Dermer, of the Netanyahu government, who will be in Washington this week. And then I might send my envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, to Israel to confirm this agreement. Oh, and I'm going to invite the embattled Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the United States next week, because that means Netanyahu won't have to appear in his bribery trial, which Donald Trump has called for to be suspended, in fact, to be stopped, because Donald Trump says it's a witch hunt against his friend Bibi. Put all those pieces together. Donald Trump is dangling the idea of getting Netanyahu off the hook of bribery charges by forcing the Israeli system to drop them so he can get a ceasefire with Gaza, despite the fact that ceasefire will probably leave Israel occupying Gaza and will still maintain the threat of starvation on more than 2 million Gazans. Everyone's a winner except the Gazan people. Here's the problem. When Netanyahu accepted the ceasefire with Iran, and he was not happy about it. And more importantly, when the hard right ministers in the Netanyahu government accepted the ceasefire with Iran, they immediately said, now we can refocus on Gaza. And what they have done in the last few days in refocusing is they have continued to bomb Gaza. They have continued to cut off humanitarian aid to Gaza, except for the token Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which provides a little bit of aid. And when people gather for it, hundreds of them have been killed by the Israeli security forces. The point here is that Trump has announced a ceasefire on social media and nobody had agreed to it. Hamas has come out and said today, well, yeah, we would love a ceasefire. We would like aid to get back in. We'd like the Israelis to stop attacking us, but also civilians. So we'll consider it. The Israeli government is scrambling right now, with the hard right minister saying, no way. With others in Israel saying, let's stop this now. Let's get our hostages back. And with Benjamin Netanyahu, now that he has more time on his hands because he doesn't have to testify in his bribery trial, trying to figure out what his next political move is. So it's Trump trying to get the Nobel Peace Prize by ruling through social media. Well, he's tried it before. Let's see if it works this time.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for speaking with me today. I mean, we've covered a plethora of issues, all of which I'm sure we're going to touch on again. So, Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Stay safe, Louis.